Watergate. The official story says a team of White House plumbers broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee, which were located in the Watergate Hotel, with the purpose of planting bugging devices and stealing documents. The sensational story broke on June 17, 1972, after 5 men were caught and arrested in the act. And 2 more would be arrested soon thereafter. But this was actually the second break-in, with the first being on May 28th. In 1974, with investigations in full swing, another 7 people linked to Nixon's administration were charged as well. It was on February 7th of 1973 that the United States Senate began its official investigation of the Watergate scandal. And they would admit at the time at the report that because all the facts are not yet in, the report is incomplete. And that's a big understatement, as we'll learn. They also say that because of the massive amount of evidence now available, it is impossible on a document of reasonable length to deal with every fact or every version of the facts. But some facts were just simply never brought to light during their investigation, and that's because only a very small handful of people knew. And ultimately, by August 8, 1974, Nixon would become the first and only United States president to resign the presidency.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
And even by then, the darkest and most nefarious secret behind Watergate was still being kept hidden away, for decades to follow. Now let's take another look at Watergate and dig out that nefarious secret that Richard Nixon worried would become public, which haunted him for the rest of his life. Now let's meet Major General Claire Chenault.
Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Pentagon announces that America needs her fighter pilots, which have been fighting valiantly to preserve the Chinese mainland against the relentless Japanese onslaught. Hit hardest by this request is General Claire Chenault and his Flying Tigers, whose mercenary band have successfully been turning back the Japanese bombers as they search for targets over mainland China. So one by one, these valiant Americans leave China and head back to their American units to fight in the South Pacific, with a special thanks from Chiang Kai-shek and the entire Chinese populace.
So he ran a volunteer group of U.S. pilots in China before the Pearl Harbor attack that were fighting off Japan's invasion of China that began in 1937, and later leading the 14th Air Force during the war. And after the war, with partners, he created Civil Air Transport, which was taken over by the CIA in 1950, and later would become Air America, and then Southern Air Transport. And you might be wondering, what does Major General Claire Chenault have to do with Richard Nixon's nefarious secrets of Watergate? Well, nothing, actually, though his Civil Air Transport would go on to be involved in other scandals that we'll have a look at in some upcoming episodes of World of Lies. But for this episode, it's actually Major General Claire Chenault's wife, Anna Chenault, that connects to the nefarious hidden secrets that Nixon was paranoid would become public. Anna Chenault was a war correspondent who first met and interviewed Major General Claire Chenault in 1946, and the two would be married in December of 1947. Major General Claire Chenault would die in 1958, and in the following years, Anna Chenault would become a Republican member of the U.S.-China lobby, as well as a political socialite, and eventually the chairwoman of the Republican Women for Nixon during his 1968 campaign. And that's when Nixon's treasonous actions take place.
Well, I'm not a crook.
To set the stage, we see on April 1st in the headlines that Lyndon B. Johnson is not going to run in the elections. And he says he's ordering a halt to the bombing runs in North Vietnam, something his top generals are against. And by the end of April, we see President Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, will enter the presidential race in place of Johnson. Alabama governor and segregationist George Wallace also entered the election as an independent, but he would place a distant third when all was said and done. It truly was a race between Humphrey and Nixon.
Well, I'm not a crook.
And the potential for peace talks in Vietnam are now on the table due to Johnson's work.
The government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam is of the view that the formal talks between Hanoi and Washington should be held immediately. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam welcomes the French government's willingness to offer Paris as a site for the talks between Hanoi's representatives and the United States.
The signals of Radio Hanoi, broadcasting a note of hope. The North Vietnamese government at last was ready to enter into formal talks about the prospects of peace. At the White House, President Johnson worked through the pre-dawn hours that Friday in order to deliver his carefully phrased response.
I was informed about 1 o'clock this morning that Hanoi was prepared to meet in Paris on May the 10th, or several days thereafter. After conferring with Secretary of State and Defense, and Ambassador Goldberg and Ball, and Secretary Harriman, and Mr. Vance, I have sent a message informing Hanoi that the date of May the 10th and the site of Paris are acceptable to the United States.
So Johnson's bombing halt and peace attempts in Vietnam are a threat to Nixon's potential White House chances. Because if Johnson can get the two sides to negotiate a peace deal, it's his Vice President, Hubert Humphrey, who stepped in for Johnson in the election, that would be the one that's seeing the benefits at the polls, with more votes likely going his way. But by September, repeated talks weren't making much headway.
On March 31st, President Johnson had ordered a bombing halt in all areas of North Vietnam except the immediate panhandle above the DMZ. As a result of this decision, the much-awaited truce talks with Hanoi began in Paris on May 13th. During September, Ambassador Averell Harriman, President Johnson's chief negotiator at the talks, reported that after 4 months and a total of 21 formal sessions, there still had been no substantive discussions.
And it's in mid-October that the beginnings of the original October surprise would start to take shape. And we see here by the end of October in a memo sent by Walt Rostrow, Ambassador Bui Diem of the Vietnamese embassy was contacted by a woman who did not identify herself, but whom he seemed to recognize by voice. The FBI believes this woman to be possibly Mrs. Anna Chenault, widow of General Claire Chenault. And during their conversations, the ambassador responded that just among us, that he could not go into specifics on the telephone, but something is cooking. And what's been cooking is Richard Nixon, working through Anna Chenault and the South Vietnamese ambassador, is secretly working together with the South Vietnamese president, Chu, to stall the peace talks and not commit to the upcoming ones in December. In another memo on November 2nd, from Walt Rostrow directly to President Johnson at 8:34 p.m., we see. On November 2, Mrs. Anna Chenault contacted Vietnamese ambassador Bui Diem and advised him that she had received a message from her boss, who we now know was Richard Nixon, which her boss wanted her to give personally to the ambassador. She said the message was that the ambassador is to, quote, "Hold on, we are going to win," end quote. And her boss also said, quote, "Hold on, he understands all of it," end quote. And quote, he said, "Please tell your boss to hold on," end quote. So Nixon's telling Chu to hold on, we are going to win, and he's meaning for Chu not to cave in to accepting the peace talks. President Johnson wants to do it, France wants to see it done and is willing to continue to host. The Communist North wants to attend the peace talks, but it seems the only ones not wanting to is South Vietnam. The U.S. election is only 3 days away, on November 5th, and the last thing Nixon wants to see in the newspaper headlines is that South Vietnamese President Chu has agreed to the peace talks. And that line of "he understands all of it" is the message to the ambassador, letting him know that President Chu knows and understands everything that's going on, and Nixon's promised him a better deal if he wins the election. Anyways, the memo goes on to say, Mrs. Chenault intended to proceed to New York City, where she would await the election results on November 5th, next, with presidential nominee Richard M. Nixon. Here's an interview with Anna Chenault from the year before, and you can get her perspective on peace talks.
This war in Vietnam, we hear all kind of experts. Some of the people might not even been to Asia and learn all the situation from books or from reports. But the people who've been out there know that only by showing our strength that we'll be able to bring the communists to the conference room. And then we can talk business. So the communists willing to come into the conference room. And I think the time when they realize it will not to their advantage to fight any longer, they will come in and talk peace. But until then, we will have to carry on our action. The longer we wait, the longer we hesitate, more of our American young men will have to be sacrificed.
More of our American young men will have to be sacrificed. She seems to be a little liberal with the lives of American troops. President Johnson had multiple different memos and intel documents and wiretaps that showed what Nixon and Chenault were up to with the South Vietnamese president and ambassador, and he finally had enough. 44 minutes after getting this memo from Walt Rostrow, President Johnson called longtime Republican Senator Everett Dirksen.
And here's the latest information we got. The agent says that they just talked to the boss in New Mexico, and that he says that you must hold out. That just hold on until after the election. Now. We know what Chew is saying to them out there. Yeah. We're pretty well informed on both ends. Yeah. Are some of our folks, including some of the old China lobby, are going to the Vietnamese embassy and saying, please notify the president that if he'll hold out till November the 2nd, they could get a better deal. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. That's right. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know.
Treason indeed. Delaying peace talks while American troops are being killed by the thousands. Despite the disturbing revelations, Johnson decided to keep the matter from going public. And a few days later, on November 5th, Richard Nixon would win the election.
Well, I'm not a crook.
On November 8th, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover would send a memo to the White House, saying that the day before, November 7th, Mrs. Anna Chenault contacted Vietnamese Ambassador Boy Diem. She advised she had given them everything. And Chenault continued that they are still planning things. Since mid-October, President Johnson had the FBI put surveillance on the Nixon campaign, monitoring and recording their dealings with the Vietnamese embassy in Washington. And at the same time, President Johnson had the CIA wiretapping South Vietnamese President Chew's office in Saigon, which is why he told Senator Dirksen on the phone call, "We're pretty well informed on both ends." Now, if you remember from Part 2, Chapter 5 of this series, J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon B. Johnson were the best of friends and neighbors for over 10 years before Johnson moved into the White House after the murder of President Kennedy. So J. Edgar Hoover knew that President Johnson had a whole pile of evidence and documentation that showed that Nixon and his campaign worked secretly with the South Vietnamese to sabotage the peace talks. And after the election, Hoover told Nixon that President Johnson had a bunch of evidence showing this, and some of that evidence was supplied by the FBI. And he also told him that the FBI doesn't have it, and that he doesn't know where Johnson put it. But now President-elect Nixon knows there's a dossier of evidence showing what he did to the peace talks in the lead up to the election. He just doesn't know where it is. Much to President-elect Nixon's dismay, the newspapers would start picking up some of the story, thanks to South Vietnamese President Chu and his officials. From the CIA cable, they're writing about President Chu's comments at a private dinner on November 11th and 12th. Chu told his guests that during the U.S. election campaign, he had sent 2 secret emissaries to the U.S. to contact Richard Nixon. And then 3 days later on November 15th in the Chicago Daily News, top Saigon officials are boasting privately they helped assure the election of Richard M. Nixon. They are pleased about it. "We did it," one of them said. "We helped elect an American president." Their reasoning is that by sabotaging President Johnson's attempt to call a bombing halt 2 weeks before the elections, they eliminated the support this would have brought for Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey. 2 days later on November 17th in the Washington Post, the explosive details have now leaked out about the backstage blow-up between the United States and South Vietnam, which threatened to wreck the Paris peace negotiations before they start. The president, and they're talking about Johnson, meanwhile learned that Saigon's ambassador Boy Diem had been in touch secretly with Richard Nixon's people. There were unconfirmed reports that South Vietnamese leaders had even slipped campaign cash to Nixon representatives. These reports made Mr. Johnson suspicious that the South Vietnamese were trying to sabotage the peace negotiations. Fortunately for Richard Nixon, the stories would gain no traction and would fizzle out just as suddenly as they appeared. And Richard Nixon would begin his presidency unscathed by his treasonous actions of sabotaging the peace talks, which was accomplished as the South Vietnamese walked away from the negotiating table the day before the election. Now fast forward to June 13th, 1971, and the New York Times would release the first in a series of what would go on to be called the Pentagon Papers, which were thousands of secret and classified documents on the Vietnam War that one-time Rand Corporation analyst Daniel Ellsberg had copied and smuggled out. And naturally, Nixon was worried that President Johnson's dossier on Nixon's 1968 Vietnam peace talk sabotage would be among the documents that would get released.
Well, I'm not a crook.
So the first thing Nixon did in the week following the New York Times' release was to start assembling his team of what would become known as the White House Plumbers, made up of former CIA and FBI agents, White House personnel, and some of the CIA-trained anti-Castro Cuban nationals as well. Nixon also immediately tried to have the courts put an injunction on the media not to be allowed to print any more of the documents, something the courts shot down, meaning the newspapers would be allowed to release the documents. Not knowing where Daniel Ellsberg was keeping the totality of the documents he was in possession of, and not knowing if President Johnson's 1968 peace talks dossier on Nixon was among them, Nixon was desperate, leading to this only 2 weeks after it all exploded in the New York Times. July 1st, 1971, the same day the courts ruled that the news media would be allowed to continue printing the Pentagon Papers, and thinking the main documents might be being held at the Brookings Institution, which at that time was very much a think tank for the Democratic Party, Nixon incredibly orders H.R. Haldeman to break into its safe. On tape, no less.
Get it done. I want it done. I want the Brookings Institute safe, clean out, and have it cleaned out in a way that it ain't somebody else will get.
2 months later, on September 3rd, 1971, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office is broken into by the plumbers, led by E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. And of course, on May 28th and June 17th of 1972, the Watergate break-ins would occur.
Well, I'm not a crook.
On November 2nd, 1972, Walt Rostow, who was President Johnson's national security advisor, but now a professor at the University of Texas, wrote to President Nixon, letting him know about a possible news story that might be coming out, and tells him. The story runs as follows. President Johnson put the FBI to work investigating the Nixon campaign in 1968. President Johnson instructed the FBI to investigate action by members of the Nixon camp to slow down the peace negotiations in Paris before the 1968 election. But again, the story would not gain any traction. But there's something else that Walt Rostow knew that he didn't tell Nixon, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But despite all the hype and attention that Watergate drew into the public spotlight, on November 7th, Nixon would easily win the 1972 election. Lyndon B. Johnson would pass away on January 22, 1973. And 2 weeks later, the Senate Watergate hearings would begin. On June 26th, Walt Rostow would drop off a package he called the X envelope to the director of the Lyndon B. Johnson Library, Harry Middleton, with a handwritten quick cover letter. To be opened by the director, Lyndon Baines Johnson Library, not earlier than 50 years from this date, June 26, 1973. On October 10, 1973, Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew would resign as a result of being caught up in his own scandal. Which of course sets the stage to bring in Gerald Ford as Vice President. The same Gerald Ford, as we saw in the Under the Grassy Knoll episode of the series, that changed the location of the bullet hole in President Kennedy's back. And by August 9, 1974,
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Something a lot of people don't know is that George H.W. Bush, who at the time was the chair of the Republican National Committee, 2 days before, on August 7th, sent Nixon a letter urging him to step down for the good of the country. And then a month later, the new President Ford gives a full pardon to Nixon. I, Gerald R. Ford, grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses during the period from January 20th, 1969 through August 9th, 1974. So Ford pardoned Nixon for anything he might have done during his presidency, from his inauguration until the day he resigned the presidency. Even if it meant murder, this pardon would cover it. But notice the dates it covers, from January 20th, 1969 through to August 9th, 1974. Nixon's treasonous actions of delaying the peace talks took place before those dates, during the 1968 election. The problem is that no one knew where the dossier was that President Johnson had compiled on what Nixon and Chenault, the South Vietnamese president, vice president, and their ambassador did. And even then, only a very small handful of people even knew it existed to begin with. So, what happened to the documents that President Johnson had that showed Nixon's collusion with the South Vietnamese government to sabotage the peace talks? And what happened is that when President Johnson had left office, he packaged up all the documents and gave the entire dossier to Walt Rostow for safekeeping. And this is the X envelope and package that Walt Rostow gave to the Lyndon Johnson Library on June 26, 1973. It contained all the evidence of what Richard Nixon, Anna Chenault, and the others did. For 18 years, the only thing anyone knew about the X envelope and package was what the handwritten note by Walt Rostow said, which was not to open anything until 50 years from that date, June 26, 1973. But Johnson Library Director Harry Middleton opened and read the X envelope on February 1st, 1991. but he didn't open the entire package. Inside the X envelope was a letter addressed to Harry Middleton, dated the same day that Walt Rostow dropped off the package to Middleton at the Johnson Library, June 26, 1973, and it was a brief description of the contents of the package. Sealed in the attached envelope is a file President Johnson asked me to hold personally because of its sensitive nature. In case of his death, the material was supposed to be consigned to the LBJ Library under conditions I judged to be appropriate. And remember, Lyndon Johnson had died earlier that year in January. The file concerns the activities of Mrs. Chenault and others before and immediately after the election of 1968. At the time, President Johnson decided to handle the matter strictly as a question of national security, and, in retrospect, he felt that decision was correct. It is therefore my recommendation to you that this file should remain sealed for 50 years from the date of this memorandum. Richard Nixon would die on April 22, 1994. And 3 months later, on July 22, 1994, the rest of the X envelope package would be opened, under the direction of Harry Middleton and Walt Rostow, and all of the evidence showing what Richard Nixon, Anna Chenault, and the South Vietnamese did would finally be exposed. We've looked at a few of the documents earlier, and here's a 3-page memorandum written by Walt Rostow on May 14, 1973, that's a little more detailed about some of what's contained within the package. The attached file contains the information available to me, and I believe, the bulk of the information available to President Johnson on the activities of Mrs. Chenault and other Republicans just before the presidential election of 1968. As the raw data themselves indicate, and the chronologies I prepared for the President on November 7th and November 11th, 1968, the story falls into 3 parts. The period from October 17th to October 29th, the period from October 29th to the election, November 5th, and the post-election period. President Johnson, in the course of October 29th, instructed Bromley Smith, Executive Secretary of the National Security Council, to get in touch with the Deputy Director of the FBI, Deke DeLoach, and arrange that contacts by Americans with the South Vietnamese Embassy in Washington be monitored. This was done, yielding the FBI evidence the folder contains. Before the election, President Johnson asked Rusk, Clifford, and me to consider the question of whether the story should be made public. On November 4th, we recommended unanimously against that course, on the grounds indicated in paragraph 3 of my title-type report to President Johnson, then at his ranch. President Johnson agreed. So that's who decided to hide Nixon's treasonous actions from the public, and part of a very small handful of people who even knew the actual evidence existed. Which also included Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover, who told them. Walt Rostow would also include this in the memorandum. I would only add these personal reflections as of mid-May 1973. I am inclined to believe the Republican operation in 1968 relates in 2 ways to the Watergate affair of 1972. First, the election of 1968 proved to be close, and there was some reason for those involved on the Republican side to believe their enterprise with the South Vietnamese and Chu's recalcitrance may have sufficiently blunted the impact on U.S. politics of the total bombing halt and agreement to negotiate to constitute the margin of victory. In other words, the election was so close that there's reason to believe that Nixon's actions of sabotaging the peace talks made up the ground needed to get a win past Hubert Humphrey. Had an agreement to hold the peace talks been announced, that would have likely been enough to put Humphrey over the edge for the win. Second, they got away with it. Despite considerable press commentary after the election, the matter was never investigated fully. And while there was press coverage of it, it was all hearsay, he said, she said type of stuff. There was literally no evidence to be found. And that's because Johnson packaged up all the evidence and gave it to Walt Rostow. They could have used that evidence during the Watergate investigations, but Rostow instead buried it in the LBJ Library, something he says he regretted in later years. And how close was the 1968 election? We can see in the polls that by November 4th, the day before the election, Humphrey made up considerable ground in the previous couple of months. And then on the day of the election, November 5th, the polls actually had Humphrey leading. Also in the headlines on the same day, November 5th, we see the South Vietnamese have called off the peace talks, and this is the result of the efforts by Richard Nixon and Anna Chenault. In the morning papers the following day on November 6th, they still haven't decided the winner of the election. Democrat Hubert H. Humphrey held the popular vote edge over Republican Richard M. Nixon early today in an all but deadlocked presidential struggle, and the arithmetic of the Electoral College raised the prospect that America's voters had failed to choose a new president. But by shortly after noon, Hubert Humphrey would concede and Nixon would become president. So imagine if instead of seeing this in the newspapers, the headline said the opposite, and peace was in sight. It's not too hard to imagine that Humphrey might have won the election instead. But even more nefarious is that Richard Nixon actively worked to prevent peace talks from taking place. Almost 36,000 U.S. troops had already been killed in Vietnam by the end of 1968. And over 20,000 more would be killed after Nixon took office. So to actively try and prevent peace talks?
This is treason.
And as much as it sounds like treason, unfortunately I have to point out that technically it's not treason. If we look at the law, the one key word that would apply to the circumstances is the word enemies. Nixon wasn't dealing with the enemy or giving them aid or comfort. Instead, he was secretly dealing with the South Vietnamese government, who was an ally. Had Nixon and Chenault done the exact same thing with the North Vietnamese, then that would qualify as treason. Now, one law that would apply to what Nixon and Anna Chenault did would be U.S. Code 953, private correspondence with foreign governments, otherwise known as the Logan Act. Any citizen of the United States who, without authority of the United States, carries on any correspondence or intercourse with any foreign government with intent to influence the measure or conduct of any foreign government in relation to any disputes with the United States or to defeat the measures of the United States shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 3 years, or both. And that's exactly what Richard Nixon did. He had no authority to negotiate, he was just a private citizen, and he had plenty of correspondence with the South Vietnamese government with the intent to influence their conduct, with the dispute being the United States government wanted the South Vietnamese government to attend the peace talks, but they didn't want to in favor of offerings from Richard Nixon if he wins the election. And Nixon's actions did indeed defeat the measures of the United States, in that the peace talks in November and December were called off by the South Vietnamese. Nixon and Anna Chenault should have got the full 3 years in jail under this law. But then again, it's the Logan Act, something that no one's ever been convicted from. But still, working to prevent peace talks, that's really, really nefarious, and sounds very treasonous nonetheless. Now let's fast forward to Watergate. And what was it actually all about? Vanity Fair in 2022 offered up a bunch of theories about it under the headline of, "Why did Nixon's team order the break-in in the first place?" And they write, "The least complicated theory remains the official one, with the end goal of bugging the office or telephone of Democratic Party Chairman Larry O'Brien. Another theory is that the burglars were ultimately looking for both financial improprieties, as well as trying to uncover any nefarious plans to disrupt the Republican convention. Another was about illegal foreign campaign finances in the Nixon campaign, and this one originates from the 1968 election, only it has nothing to do with Vietnam. Another theory they put out there is that it was a CIA plot. And the last theories they put out there is the Democrats and or the DC police had sprung it as a trap. And they go on to write, the evidence for and against each theory has filled entire books in a half-century since, but all remain frustratingly inconclusive. And that's because these reasons aren't the underlying cause for Watergate. If you want to understand the question and answer of why did they break into Watergate in the first place, then you have to go back to when the break-ins first began. Nixon knew that President Johnson had compiled a dossier of Nixon's actions in sabotaging the peace talks in 1968, but he had no idea where it was, and he was paranoid of it becoming public. And then suddenly in June of 1971, the New York Times started publishing the top-secret classified Pentagon Papers, detailing secrets from the Vietnam War. And Nixon immediately started putting together his team of White House plumbers, named for their mission of stopping the leaks. And the leak of the Pentagon Papers mostly showed the Kennedy and Johnson administrations in a bad light. There wasn't anything terribly bad about Nixon, really, but they were a bunch of classified documents concerning Vietnam, and at the time, Nixon couldn't know what was going to be released, and he was scared that the sabotage dossier that President Johnson had compiled on him would be among them and get leaked out at some point. So, on July 1st, 1971, a year and a half before the election, he starts ordering break-ins. I would also add that it's more than likely and probable that Nixon didn't tell anyone about the dossier that Johnson had compiled. He's just telling his team to find anything that's classified on Vietnam, and anything with his name on it. Planting bugs was indeed part of the Watergate mission. That would allow Nixon's team to listen in and hear for any dirt the DNC had on Nixon. But the underlying reason for the break-ins goes back to Nixon's role in sabotaging the 1968 peace talks. And Nixon didn't need to cheat to win this election, as he was clearly the favorite across the country right from the get-go. And we can see this because even despite the explosion of Watergate all over the media, who were linking it to the Nixon administration for months leading up to the election, Nixon would still easily win in the election in a landslide. So anyways, that's the nefarious secret behind Richard Nixon and Watergate. And before we close out, let's have another look at Anna Chenault. And she was friends with George H.W. Bush years before hooking up with Richard Nixon in the 1968 election. So that's pretty interesting. And here she is decades later with Vice President and then President George H.W. Bush. So they had a decades-long relationship. And here she is meeting with other future presidents as well. So for someone who helped Nixon sabotage the 1968 peace talks, she did rather well for herself.
More of our American young men will have to be sacrificed.